America. My name is Irony Osei-Frimpong, and you're watching this week's edition of the Black Athenians. I'm here in Athens, Georgia, and I try to give a quality of politics that'll help you understand your life. And I think, so COVID-19 does a lot of work on our institutions, and one aspect of the work it does on our institutions is that it needs to be interpreted. And if you don't interpret what the virus means for our social and political life, then other people will interpret it for you to their advantage. I'm here to interpret it in a way that I think works for like working class people and everyday people, so that we're not, the disease isn't being used as a pretext for us to be turned into food for more predatory and for our enemies, pretty much our class enemies, and for more predatory forces in American life. So today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how COVID makes us primitive. And primitive here is just set up in distinction from more progressive or more advanced, right? So there's a way in which, for example, the washing machine turned primitive labor into, like, it was an institution of freedom. I think it's one of the bigger institutions of freedom in the 20th century, because it turned something that used to take like 40 hours a week into something that takes, like two. So it's probably one of the biggest like physical institutions of freedom since like the vote. So there are different ways of going from more primitive modes of production to more efficient, more advanced ones. And industrialization is a form of going from, and the division of labor is a form of going from more primitive ways of doing it, where everyone does everything so well and so efficiently, to a division of labor where we get people who are good at building things, people who are good at writing things, people who are good at being doctors. So this division of labor actually created a better society where more people were free, because then I created a surplus and I could go and sell my surplus on the market, and other people could buy that surplus while they created a surplus for me. So we started mutually producing things for each other, and then we got really good at the thing we were producing, and that kind of turned a more primitive society into an industrial society, or a more industrial society. And we got factories, and then we started producing industrial waste. So this gets complicated really quickly. But the move from more primitive modes of production to more advanced modes of production, and seeing that linked to freedom, is very important. Because if I had to, for example, take all of my trash that I accumulate over the week and take it myself to the dump, that would be unfortunate. Now we have we're a more industrial society. We have professionals who come to my house and take my trash away. And I want to segue this into chapter 13 of Angela Davis's, Women, Class, and Race, or Women, Race, and Class. It's a fantastic book. The chapter I'm talking about is, it's a series of essays, came out in the 80s, and it's a series of essays she wrote in the 70s and 80s, and I think she did her best work then. But chapter 13 is on the obsolescence of housework. She's like, look, we need to take the industrial kind of sensibility, the industrial socialized sensibility that we've moved out into the work out of house, and bring it in-house. There's no reason why like house cleaners should just be for people who can pay for them, because they're actually really nice to have, right? And if you have if you have like a team of professionals come and clean everyone's house, just like we have a team of professionals that picks up garbage, and we could subsidize it, socialize it, but mostly we just need to industrialize it, because an infinite amount of housework doesn't make anyone particularly interesting or creative, because you're not dealing with another person. You're dealing with a mess, right? So we should socialize professionals, and everyone should get a voucher. I think everyone should get a voucher for like a house cleaner that pays like 80%. And then I think that would be an institution of freedom that would, I think, one, keep marriages together in a way that we're not honest about. Two, we could actually unionize and organize the housekeepers, and they would be professionals. They'd be efficient. They just boom, 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 boom. Because if you've ever seen a professional house cleaner work, they're very efficient. They know their job, and that job should be paid. And I've come around on this, I read the article, but then I talked to people because I didn't have house cleaners when I grew up. But when I talked to people, it turns out that the people who have them like them. And if they're paid well, that's a good thing. So there's a way to industrialize this labor. And Davis argues that the reason it's continued to be primitive is because, well, like women do it disproportionately in the house. And if it were, I think like they figured this out in a submarine, right? They've pretty much socialized and industrialized all the labor in a submarine, and that works. So I want to set the distinction between primitive and on one side versus industrialized, socialized, or subsidized on the other, right? So this labor still gets done in both ways, but how it gets done and who it gets done by and the efficiency and how many people are involved matters. For example, making a movie right now is not a primitive process. If you want to make a movie, you need a team. You need best boys, you need grips, you need all those people in the credits. You could do a primitive movie, but it won't be as good as the one that's been industrialized. It won't have the same production value because one, not as many resources went into production, but you won't bring as many experts into it. One of the things I kind of resent about doing this podcast, it's not a podcast because I haven't like spent the time to figure out how to put it on Apple and all that. Like I need a fleet of producers. I think if I had like 2 producers, you'd get better quality. But instead, I have to figure out like what kind of microphone to buy and what kind of and not all of my equipment works all the time because it's me manning it, and I have other things to do like read all of the books that will give you content. So like if this were a less primitive production, I think it would probably be better for the world. So that's why you should go to thefunkyacademic.com. I'd have my nameplate under, but since I have to do everything every week, some things get left behind. And since I had to move all everything, So if you go to funkyacademic.com and give $5, $15, or $50 a month, or just a one-time enormous donation, I think you would get a better product because I would have equipment that worked. I might come more closely to 4 o'clock on the dot. There would be better production values, and it'd be easier to share because the experience would be better, and my mouth and the sound would sync all of the time. And so if I could industrialize this show, it would be a better show. And insofar as this show is an institution of freedom, that would mean the world would be more free for the quality of wisdom that I dispense. Right. So this move for what COVID-19 has done has made everyone more primitive. For example, I have 3 kids. I have a 5-year-old, a 7-year-old, and a 2-year-old who are now like with me a lot. And it's hard to be as efficient at doing the book work and thinking work that I do with 3 kids around because we've industrialized education. We've industrialized childcare insofar as I used to dispense my 2-year-old at the daycare, and then my 5 and 7-year-old had school and then daycare, and then I had books and a dissertation. So we industrialize that kind of childcare. Now it's primitive because now I do everything. I homeschool my kids, which is fine. It turns out I'm pretty good at it to an extent, but it's a lot. It's a lot. I would rather be doing other things and let a professional do that. And yeah, because I used to just do it in the summers and they would be fine, but now I do it every day, which is a lot. And it's it's consuming, right? So it's consuming in a way that the industrialized version, where I just send them off to professionals who did this at a sufficiently paid profession, that was better. But I do it, and it's good for them because I know how to do a lot of things. But I don't teach them everything. I teach them what I know, which is like reading and writing. I happen to know a lot, but anyway. So it's our education right now is primitive as opposed to industrial. It's primitive as opposed to socialized. All right, and that's very important for you to understand the distinction, because I'm going to go into a place that you didn't know that I was going to in this video when you clicked on this video, and it's going to be about sex. Right? So I was watching Mrs. America. It's when the kids go down, sometimes I got to decompress. So I put the kids down and I watch Hulu, Mrs. America. It's on Phyllis Schlafly. And I think Phyllis Schlafly is very important because unless we understand like the very smart women who are anti-feminists, we're not going to understand how like maybe there might be a problem with feminism, right? So it's not that Phyllis Schlafly was right. It's that the feminists aren't that different from Phyllis Schlafly as they think they are. So like, there's a lot going on there. And they're the same with the anti-suffragists in the early 20th century. The Mildred Rutherfords and the Josephine Dodges. These are very smart women who understood that being a white woman, especially of a certain class in America, is something that even being a white guy isn't. It's a privileged and protected class, and they thought they had more power than their husbands in some ways, but they had less power in other ways. But it wasn't the worst deal in the world. And the feminists were screwing up their good thing, and some of them argue that the feminists wanted to eat out of both sides of the trough, which I do. I am one of those guys who argue that feminists want it both ways. They want the perks of white womanhood, and they want the perks of white womanhood, but they don't want, which means like a dicey relationship with responsibility and politics, honestly, without, but they want the privileges of like the people who actually take responsibility and risk. So I'm not a feminist. I believe in equal rights, but that means you need equal of the bad things too, and we need to kind of work out how that works, and in a way that makes a lot of feminists uncomfortable because I take away some of their privileges as women. They're like, we don't have any privileges as women. That's just not true. That's just not true, especially if you're white. And then if you're black and you expect the privileges of white womanhood, you end up divorced because you're not going to get them. For some reason, because like guys aren't positioned like white guys. So there's that. But let's talk about Mrs. America, Phyllis Schlafly. So she is, a 1970s upper class housewife. She has black help in the middle of Illinois. And she married an older lawyer, and she's a smart woman. And there's a great scene in the first episode where she comes home from doing a speaking tour because she was speaking against the ERA. She didn't want equal rights to women. She didn't want women to be drafted and go off to fight the war. She didn't want women to be expected to do things that she wanted men to do. And so she was worried that equal rights would entail that. So she went off and spoke, and then she came back home, and then her husband hadn't seen her in a few days, and so he wanted to have sex, and so she just kind of had sex with him because he wanted to have sex. And it was pretty obvious from the scene in the picture that it was kind of it was a spousal rape, what I would consider spousal rape. I think a lot of white people in the suburbs just call that sex, but I consider it spousal rape. And here's how that worked out. I did some other reading on Phyllis Schlafly, and she has this great quote in like 2007. When she's old, she's like, look, I consented to sex. Women consent to sex when they're married, so like there's no such thing as spousal rape. Which means that like she just spent decades being raped by her husband. In my estimation, I'm sure she would say that it was just like a chore. It was just something, it was part of the gig. And that's how it ties into Housework. Because I know there are no, and I found out about this a little bit later, there are no small number of white women, or people married to white guys anyway, who think about sex as a chore, like on the order of like dishes and vacuuming. It is nothing other than a chore that you do as being part of as being part of like, this suburban white flight family, right? And I think white women are getting raped all over the suburbs, and it kind of makes sense. If they don't call it rape, they just call it sex. I would call it rape, but it kind of makes sense insofar as that jackass white guy who like, is like a sociopath in most other aspects of his life, somehow he's like really thoughtful and giving in bed? No. And about sex? No. It's the same dude. And I think Eldridge Cleaver actually said this very well. It's either in the Book of Negroes. I don't think it's on Soul. It's in the Book of Negroes. It's in one of his other diaries where he said like if you don't revolutionize, Cleaver used the word fucking. If you don't revolutionize fucking, if you could revolutionize everything else, but if you keep fucking the same, then it'll just be a regressive force that screws up everything else. So you got to revolutionize. You got to get freedom all the way down. That means you got to get rid of, all these institutions of oppression all the way down to sex. Because if you leave sex as it is, and I think if you leave sex and religion as are, you could do all of the other political interventions you want, but repressive sex and repressive religious like doctrine will infect all of the other social and political entanglements. I can go into another argument about that, but I'm just right. You'll just have to take it at my word now. But you gotta revolutionize how we think about sex if you're gonna revolutionize how we think about anything else, especially in terms of race and labor politics. And insofar as sex for these people isn't sex, it's a chore, there's a way in which this inability to turn these institutions of oppression, primitive institutions of oppression, into institutions of freedom in the household includes sex, right? So we haven't socialized sex. And socializing sex just means it's not just a one-sided chore that you do because there's a mess in the same way you clean it. It's a process that's worked out between two people. that we figure out how we share the burdens and responsibilities of what's happening and the pleasure of what's happening. Right? So that's just what it means to turn sex from a primitive institution, which is, I think, this white suburban sex. Look, you got it. They have an entire culture, these white people, they have an entire culture that tells them to just get raped for the rest of their marriage and that's okay because they get the nice house. It starts with the church camp and it goes all the way up to like, I don't know, this vision of authority and headship in a marriage. So that's their problem. I'm telling you how it could be better. And if you think I'm lying, I'm not lying. I'm not lying about none of it. It's not our problem. Black people, we have different problems. Anytime someone tries to import white masculinity into black males, it's not like nothing about what relationships transfers because nothing about white life, like nothing about being a white man in America is the same as being a black man in America. So like all the way down, it's actually inverse. So, don't listen to the feminists. What I'm trying to tell you though, is that we need to what COVID-19 tells us is that the industrial and social interactions that made life less primitive and turned life into institutions of freedom. So I only had to do one job, not do all of the jobs. Those networks need to be, they can't be reopened as is, but they need to be thought about as what's at stake, right? We need like rural broadband. We need communication networks. I'll do a whole show on how we need to refigure networks of communication in order to make life somewhat free. Because as it stands, if we do everything as it's given to us before it's been industrialized and socialized, or we do it because of tradition, right? So there's going to be like legitimized progress on one side, that's reason, and it's been thought through how, like, for example, the washing machine is an institution of freedom because it saves like 30 hours a week. So there's going to be these kinds of institutions of freedom that can be justified by reason. And on the other side, there are going to be all these institutions of oppression that are justified by tradition and justified by nature. Just by nature, we should all just die of whatever people die of. Or there shouldn't be there's nothing about a colonoscopy that's natural. but instead we have them when we turn 40 or 45, and like that's fighting nature in order of, like, a colonoscopy is an institution of freedom. So is, like, a vasectomy, an institution of freedom. By nature, we should just, like, risk having kids every time we have sex. I think that makes people less free. I'm a fan of birth control. So as an institution of freedom. So on one side we have tradition. On the other side we have institutions of freedom that can be legitimized through reason. And like, I can put my will in the world and actually externalize myself. As, for example, a show host. If it were less primitive, I would have, like, producers, and there would be a whole thing. But by the way, if you want me to have producers in the whole thing, once again, go to thefunkyacademic.com or funkyacademic.com and kick in $5, $15, or $50 a week. There's a link. It says PayPal, but you can just put in a regular old credit card and just give what your heart wants. If you want me to be free, or if you want me to continue freeing you through this wisdom. So on one side you have tradition or nature, the other side you have institutions of freedom, and COVID-19 has thrown all of our institutions of freedom, and these institutions of freedom depend on industrialization. They depend on socialization. They depend on subsidies. They depend on a functioning state, a stable state. Like, it's thrown us all back into like a more primitive life. It's a more primitive life. I mean, people aren't growing their own food. I still live next to a Kroger that's moderately stocked, but it's a more, like, it's not an institution of freedom in the same way, for no other reason than, like I said, I always have kids around now, which is different. I definitely feel less free for that. If we're going to actually turn sex into something that's, or if we're going to revolutionize America, that means, unfortunately, we got to revolutionize the way white people fuck. Which, I do it for the culture. And culture is what, by the way, nature is what tells us what to do with biology. People don't have nature, they have culture. Culture is what tells us how to install institutions of freedom. I do it for the culture. Because if their aggressive screwing is going to end up sustaining more aggressive politics, that's going to screw up the whole nation. So that's why I do this. So we need to make the Schlafly sex into an institution of freedom and not a one-sided chore. So we need to socialize sex. Socialized sex just means that, like, it's not just a one-sided affair that's primitive and whose norms are thrown down by tradition or convention. Actually, they're justified by reason and by respecting the other person as a rational agent with wants and desires and pleasures, trying to externalize themselves. Because if sex is just seen for men, which apparently, like, these white people have screwed up notions of sex, people. If sex is just seen of, like, for one-sided partners, then it's just an institution of oppression. Or a tradition, it's not an institution of freedom. So we need to socialize sex, and that way we can socialize everything else. And what COVID-19 teaches us is that socialization and industrialization comes with these this division of, like, the division, not just a division of responsibility and division of labor. It comes with this social process, right? Where I don't have to do everything, where everyone's not doing everything. And there's a way in which just the idea of the emancipated, they call it emancipated, but the single family detached house, the idea of the single family detached house, if it's, like, sequestered from all of these other institutions, is kind of a primitive institution. It can be an institution of freedom insofar as you're emancipated from the sway of, like, the greater clan. That's why, for example, Hegel argued for the single-family detached house, because he said, like, without that, you're always in control of some uncle. Or that was the argument. So, like, there's a way in which the nuclear family is an emancipation from the greater clan interest. So you guys can now decide as a nuclear family what you should do. But there's a way in which, if it's sequestered away from all of these other civic institutions, it becomes a place where now you have to do everything by yourself, right? Like, there are no grandmas and aunts to watch the kids, right? So, like, so we need to think about how to turn all of these institutions of tradition into institutions of freedom. And that goes all the way down to the institution of sex. So I've said a word, in the last 24 minutes. So go ahead and tweet this to your friends. And you're not going to church, so just put this in your in your social media group and talk about this at your Zoom Sunday school. But just know that it's asymmetrically making us primitive, right? So some people with, I want to say 27 million. I know definitely 22 million. It might have gone up to 27 million. 27 million people now don't have a job by filing for unemployment, which means there's the loosest employment market since slavery. Like out there, you're going to be able to buy up not just Negroes, but even, other people for cheap, right? So our labor now, if we don't get our politics right, is going to be sold, because we're still a market society. We still need money to eat and to live and to be free ourselves. So, but our labor market power, unless we have a political intervention, is going to be like rock bottom, right? So the people who can afford to buy people will buy whole people and employ whole people to service all of their needs. So they'll be able to be self-determining insofar as they have an entire institution producing for them. But like for workers, we don't have any worker power unless we have a politics that's adequate to the situation. So we need a politics that's adequate to the situation, and a politics that's adequate to the situation will reflect the fact of mutual production and industrialization and mutuality that's required for institutions of freedom, right? I need sanitation people because I don't have time to also take all of my trash to the dump. I need water sanitation people because I don't have time and the effort to test all of my water all of the time. I need drinking water that's clean coming out of my pipes all of the time so I can worry about other things. I can't also be playing defense against nature, right? So we're constantly producing for each other in order for us to be free. And that's what freedom is, having other people produce for you. And real freedom is having other people produce for you in a way that you produce for them. So it's like a mutually reinforcing system. And that's what a market that works is supposed to do. But it's for other reasons I can go into a different video. It's so dynamic that it might punish people for becoming experts in, for example, beeper sales. If it's 1999 and I'm the best beeper salesman, the market might, or the best 8-track factory maker, the market might, or Tower Records, right? The market might just leave me behind. So I need to find a way to secure people against the vicissitudes or the swings of the market if we want to keep markets. But markets are institutions of freedom insofar as they enable us to produce for each other and kind of domesticate the world and each other in a way that allows us to be free and actually have time, and our decisions are respected and enabled by, but then the market needs to be policed because there's also industrial waste and all these externalities and things the market produces that it needs to deal with. Or we need to make sure it's subsidized. So the inability to put domestic labor on, so if markets are what drive innovation, and the household has been kind of sequestered from the market, then domestic labor hasn't actually improved, hasn't been improved through a mechanism of innovation. I mean, there's a reason why the households don't look like submarines. Don't work like submarines. Where like it's just a bunch of guys. Because mostly there's good reason to believe that it's because we've shunted this work disproportionately on women, and that's a problem. And I just want to think through the right way to turn that conventional division of labor into a justified one. So the labor gets done. It's done in a way that's appropriately industrialized, subsidized, and socialized. And that labor also includes, and this is my own intervention, sex. Because I think a lot of people are having conventional primitive sex, which is tantamount to rape. because for a lack of understanding, sex is also an institution that needs to be moved out of tradition and into an institution of freedom. Good. I think I've said a word. Maybe you want to go back and read and watch this a few times, because I went through a lot of arguments right there. But if you think of sex as a chore, and chores are primitive, then you're having primitive sex, which is de facto oppressive, and it looks a lot like the sex that Phyllis Schlafly was having in that docudrama and advocated for in real life in 2007. So I hope this has been helpful. I hope that you understand how now we need to think about what industrialization looks like in the times of COVID-19 and what socialization looks like in the times of COVID-19. Because now everybody doing everything for themselves is really not allowing them to be free. We're too busy, watching 2-year-olds and 5-year-olds and 7-year-olds. All right. Thank you, and help me industrialize and modernize this show by kicking me some money, because the better production value will make it easier to distribute. Peace.